I wanted to talk about a habit, not the obvious ones, not the ones that show up on lists. This one is invisible. Most men have it. Most men never notice it, and it does more damage quietly over decades than almost anything else I can think of. I noticed it in myself first. This pattern of thinking, so automatic, I barely recognize it as a thought. When things slow down a bit, I'll, once the kids are a little older, when this project is finished, then I'll actually fill in whatever comes after. Spend more time with people. Do the thing I keep saying I want to do. Be more present, more deliberate, more myself. It's a sentence I'd been completing my whole adult life. Different versions, same structure. I will live the life I actually want later. And I never noticed, not really noticed, that later was never arriving. Because there was always another condition to meet first. I think this might be the most common habit among men in midlife, the perpetual deferral. And the reason it's so invisible is that it always sounds reasonable in the moment. The conditions are real. The responsibilities are real. And the timing is genuinely difficult. So the deferral feels justified. It doesn't feel like avoidance. It feels like patience, like being responsible, like understanding that the good stuff requires earning. And in small doses, that's probably true. But at some point, and this is what I want to talk about, the deferral stops being a strategy and becomes a way of life, a default setting. A man who has deferred so many things for so long that he's lost track of what he was waiting to actually do. What he was waiting to actually be. But here is the strange part. Most men do this, and I mean most, don't experience it as deferral. They experience it as a discipline, a sacrifice in service of something greater, as the responsible choice. And they're not entirely wrong. Sacrifice is real. Discipline matters. But the truth is deeper than that. Because for a lot of men, the deferral isn't really about the circumstances. The circumstances just give it the cover. The real thing underneath, the thing that the deferral is protecting against, is something more uncomfortable. The risk of actually living. The risk of wanting something specific, of pursuing it, of it mattering, of it possibly not working out. Because as long as the good life is deferred, as long as it lives in the future, in the conditional, it can never disappoint you. You can never fail at it. You can never lose it. And most men never notice this. They think they're being patient, when actually they're being safe. I want to stay with that for a moment, because I think it's important. There's a specific kind of man, and I've been this man, and I recognize him in a lot of others, who is incredibly good at building towards something, but very uncomfortable actually arriving. The arrival feels exposed. When you're building, you're protected by the future. There's always another phase, another milestone. The real thing is still ahead. But when you arrive, when the conditions you were waiting for are finally met, you have to actually show up. Be present. Be honest. Be the person you said you'd be when things settle down. And that, for a lot of men, is the terrifying part. Not the work, not the sacrifice, the arrival. And so the habit forms. The goalpost moves. Another condition gets added. Not consciously, just automatically. Because the moving goalpost keeps the arrival at a safe distance. And this is where things become interesting. Because the habit that quietly ruins man's life isn't laziness. It's the opposite of laziness. It's a man who works very hard at avoiding the moment when he has to finally leave. And something changes after 40 that makes this habit more dangerous. Time stops feeling like a renewable resource. When you're 30 and deferring, the future feels spacious enough to absorb the delay. There's time. There's plenty of it. The deferred thing will happen eventually. But after 40, and it happens differently for every man, there's a quiet shift in how the math feels. The things you've been deferring start to have a different weight. Not impossible, not out of reach, but no longer indefinitely available either. And this is where the habit starts to cost in a way it didn't before. Because the deferred life, the version of yourself you've been putting off, is no longer waiting patiently. It's starting to recede. Not gone, but farther than it was. And most men feel this and don't know what to name it. That background urgency, that low hum of something important, running slightly out of time. Here is what I think is really going on. Underneath the habit of deferral is a belief most men carry without examining it. The belief that the real version of their life requires conditions that don't currently exist. more money, more time, less stress, a different job, a different phase, some version of things being easier than they are right now. And the belief feels logical. It points to real constraints. But here is the psychological truth underneath it. The real version of your life, the more honest, more present, more genuinely yourself version, doesn't actually require those conditions. It requires something much simple and much harder. A decision. The decision to stop treating your own life as something that begins after the current circumstances improve, and to start inhabiting the life you actually have with the person you actually are right now. Not perfectly, not with everything resolved, just consciously, with some deliberate attention to what actually matters. Most men wait for the conditions to change. The men who seem most alive, the one who seem most themselves, made the decision before the conditions changed. They stopped deferring not because life got easier, but because they decided that waiting was costing more than moving. So let me ask you to look at something honestly. Is there a version of yourself, a way of living, something you care about, that you've been deferring? Not forever, just until the mortgage is smaller, until work calms down, until the kids need you less, and you feel more ready. I'm not asking you to feel guilty about it. I'm asking you to notice how the deferral, how long has been running. Because if it's been running for 5 years, if the thing you've been waiting to do has been waiting for 5 years, the condition you are waiting for may not be the actual barrier. The barrier may be the habit itself, the way the mind has learned to always locate the good life just slightly ahead of where you are. And that habit doesn't break by waiting. It breaks by noticing it and then making one small choice that doesn't defer. One thing this week, this month, this year, not a transformation. Just one thing. You stop putting off. That's how it starts. The habit that quietly ruins men's lives doesn't feel like distraction. That's why it's so effective. It feels like patience, like reasonable, responsible patience. But over decades, it becomes a kind of exile. A man exiled from his own actual life by a perpetual belief that the real thing is coming later. And the cost of that exile doesn't usually show up in a single moment. It accumulates in the relationships that got less of you than they deserved, in the things you still haven't done, in the private knowledge, the kind you can only have about yourself, that you've been managing your life or then living it. And that's what the habit costs. And the reason I'm talking about it is that it's reversible. Not instantly, not without effort, but the moment a man recognizes the pattern, really sees it for what it is, the habit loses some of its power because it can only operate in the dark, in the space where you believe you're being patient rather than seeing that you're deferring yourself. Name it, and it changes. Not everything, but enough. I think about the version of this I practiced for years. The conditions I was waiting for, some of which arrived, some of which never did. And what I've noticed, walking around with a little more honesty these days, is that the life I was waiting to live was largely available to me the whole time. I just kept filing it under later. And later is a place you can live your whole life without ever actually arriving. The walk you're on right now, this day, this version of your life, this is the one. Not the practice version, not the waiting room. This is it.